These are some of the supplies I'm going to be using. You can find a list of these supplies in the video description. I'm going to be painting on a watercolor block today. Also in the video description is going to be a line drawing that you can access and print at home for your own use. We are going to transfer today's subject. In order to do that, I need you to put graphite on the back of the line drawing after it's printed, tape it to the top of your watercolor paper, and then using the pressure of a ballpoint pen or pencil, simply trace this line drawing. After you get a short distance, I want you to peek, make sure the lines are transferring. It should be a medium gray. If it's coming out black, that's too much pressure. If the line is barely visible, that's not enough pressure. Once you're done tracing the entire image, you can make sure all your lines have transferred and then remove the line drawing from your watercolor paper. Now in your line drawing, you will also notice that I have some random areas of red which actually indicate where you could consider putting masking fluid. The masking fluid I use is this particular brand. I like it because it's easily visible and I can see where I'm applying it. These small areas where all the red is are areas where there's bright white in our reference photo. So this is just here for your guide. I went ahead and used a liner brush to get some of the thin lines around the areas where some of the feathers will be. I simply used dish soap and water on my brush before I dipped it in the masking fluid and then applied. So you can see here that I've applied all the masking fluid I wanted. You can add more or less, it's really just up to you. But once the masking fluid is dry, then we can go ahead and begin. I'm going to start by adding a little bit of color to my background. So I'm going to be applying heavy clean water around the exterior of my bird. I'm trying to make sure that when I apply water close to the edge, that I'm making sure to embrace the texture of the feathers and not smooth it out so much. I'm allowing there to be some bumps and ridges. I'm not feeling the need to get super close to the outside edge of my bird because with this clean water, it's really hard to tell if I am right up to my pencil line or not. So I'd rather be a little bit further away from my pencil line than risk getting inside my bird. So I'm just taking my time, but I'm really being liberal with the amount of clean water I'm applying. Once I get close to my subject, I really slow down my pace. This water should be treated as if it's equally important as when you apply paint, because it will determine where your paint goes. I'm occasionally taking a look at my wet surface from a side glance so I can check on the sheen of the water and reapply in any areas that might already be drying. I don't go very far before I re-dip in my water, so I really am being heavy with my application. If you accidentally get some water inside your bird or the branch, you can simply dab with firm pressure using a clean paper towel to soak that up. Now that I've taken my time and gone around the outer edge of my bird, I'm now speeding up just to cover the rest of my background. It's completely optional whether or not you want to cover the entire background. I like to just cover it with water, and then my paint will determine how far it goes, making some uneven edges in the background. Once you have a good glossy surface all over your background, then you can add your background color. I am going to be doing a mixture of Viridian Hue and my burnt sienna to give it a little bit more of an earthy tone. And I'm going to really be diluting my color so it's not too dark. With the added water on my paper, it should go on pretty light. So just with Viridian Hue and burnt sienna, I'm able to get this really beautiful olive green. So I'm just carefully going around the outer edges of my subject. Just for the sake of the video, I'm trying not to rotate my watercolor paper. However, I encourage you to rotate your paper so you're working comfortably. At this stage, I'm embracing the puddles because they're just going to help things stay wet while I work around my subject. I'm really taking my time up against my pencil's edge. If I'm running out of my paint color, I simply grab some more Viridian Hue and burnt sienna and mix on the spot. It doesn't have to be super exact, as long as I'm kind of in the same family. My paper is starting to lose that high gloss shine, which makes me aware that I need to pick up my pace, or I can use a fine water mister that is often used in hair salons, and I can mist my paper to kind of prolong my working time. But I am personally going to try and just pick up my pace. So to ensure your paper doesn't dry as quickly, you could choose to apply 2 different layers of water. After that first layer of water is applied, give it a few seconds to really absorb into the fibers of the paper, and then go ahead and apply a second layer of water just to prolong your working time. If I accidentally end up getting some background color on the nails of the bird's feet, I'm not too worried about it because they are a darker value. So I should be able to just kind of go right over top of my background color and fix any things that I don't like. So don't feel like you need to get stressed if you can't get around these narrow little claws that are on the ends of the feet. You can also switch to a smaller brush to make things easier on you. So right now you can kind of see that my paint is coming in contact with an area of dry paper. To ensure I have a nice kind of painterly outer edge, I'm simply cleaning off my brush, and with a wet brush before this dries, I come in and apply water on the outer edge to kind of extend that paint into the damp paper so it looks a little bit more like the rest of it. I made a point to kind of extend my branch off the edge of my watercolor paper, even though my line drawing may not have been large enough. I just kind of made it up. And here again, I'm running into dry paper. So rather than stressing about it, I'm just going to rinse the paint out of my brush, put some clean water on my brush, and put that clean water right next to that edge that is starting to dry. I'm going to go ahead and just leave this more painterly background to add a little bit more character. I can even come in with some splashes of clean water around the outer edge. And that excess water is going to come into contact with areas of my paper that have already begun to dry, and it's going to create a blooming effect, which just gives a little bit of interest to this background. Before I call this background done, I am going to look for excessive puddling, and I'm going to absorb those with a dry brush. So I removed all of the paint out of my brush with the use of my kitchen sponge here. And once my paint and water is removed from my brush is then dry and wants to naturally absorb any moisture it comes in contact with. So I'm just drying my brush and then using my dry brush to tap the top surface of any puddling. And the reason I'm not letting these puddles sit is if I let them sit through the drying process, I will get unpredictable results that I may not necessarily like or want. I'm just adding a little bit more color and value to the areas of my background that are still damp and workable. Okay, so now I'm happy with my background. I'm now going to let this dry completely or use a blow dryer, and then I can get started on the bird. Now that the background is completely dry, I'm going to begin working on the feathers of my bird. I'm going to get my colors ready on my palette. So I want a little bit of permanent rose. I want a little bit of purple lake. I want kind of a mixture of purple lake and permanent rose, so I have like this in-between value. I'm just going to get a little bit of Viridian Hue on its own. Get some Cerulean Blue ready to go. And then last but not least, I'm going to get some burnt sienna going. All right, to start off, I'm going to start with my warm colors, so I have a little sense of control of where they're going. So my warm colors are going to be on the lower half of the head as well as the chest. So I'm going to put a little bit of water in here just to extend my working time, but I'm not being super particular with where my water is up against my edges. I'm giving just plenty of space. Now I had put some thin line work in here with the masking fluid to kind of maintain a few little light values. I can just paint right over that masking fluid. I don't have to worry about avoiding it. That's what it's there for. We'll peel it up later. I am trying to be aware of the whites that are near the beak though. I don't want to cover up those white feathers. So once I get just some general water down on the chest and lower portion of the head, I'm going to start with my lighter permanent rose color. And I'm trying to use the end of my round brush so I can get some nice tapered points to my feathers. And when this color comes in contact with the water, it's obviously going to want to move a bit, which is fine. But since I didn't bring my water all the way up to the edges, I'm able to kind of create this texture using the paint, and I can clearly see where it's at. So once I have some of those pinks in, I'm going to get some of that purple lake added. This is a lighter value of my purple lake. I don't like to go too dark too fast. You can already see there's some areas where I had applied some masking fluid and it's resisting my paint, so those are those thin, narrow white areas you're seeing. But I'm trying to follow the direction of the bird feathers, using the end of my round brush to my advantage to kind of help with the texture. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to my pink so I get a little bit of a darker value. And with this darker value, I'm going to go on the head. I can get real close to the eye as long as my color's not too dark. If I have puddling of paint, making it difficult to kind of control, I can dry my brush off and just absorb that excess paint puddles, so it's easier to maintain where my paint is going. I'm continuing to be very aware of where the white feathers are above the eye and around the beak area. I'm going to add some more of that dark purple lake. If it kind of spreads, I'm okay with that. Now when I get close to the outer edge of my bird feathers and that background color, I really slow down. You could even switch to a small brush if it gives you confidence and the visibility you need to know where you're applying your colors. and rotate your paper if it's going to make things easier on you. Don't work uncomfortably and bend your wrist and arm in weird positions. Just rotate your watercolor paper. So before I call this first layer of warm tones done, I'm just taking a moment to really look at my reference photo, find any other dark tones that I might need to capture before I let this first layer dry. I have a little bit more reds that I just want to get in by the eye. So while that area is drying, I can't paint anything near because I don't want the colors to blend and give me unexpected results. So I'm going to let that area have some space. I'm going to move on to the top of the head, and I have just a watered down version of my burnt sienna. It's a small area of lighter browns towards the top forehead of the bird. So I'm just painting wet on dry. Again, being very aware of those whites that are above the beak. And notice how light in value my browns are. I'm really trying not to go too dark too fast. I want to be able to build my layers and values because that's going to give me the depth and three-dimensionality that I want. So I'm constantly pausing to look at my reference photo to kind of help guide me in where I should be applying these softer browns. While those softer browns on the forehead are drying, I can now move on to the back of the bird, and there's a larger area here where we have some of those soft brown tones again. But because it's a larger area and because I don't really want a bunch of uncontrolled texture, I am applying just a little bit of water in here. I'm not being super perfect, bringing my water right up to the edges. I'm actually giving it a little bit of space. Now in this area here on the lower side of my wing, I'm not real happy with how jagged that edge is from my background. So I can actually take a more stiff square brush, and with water on it, I can actually come in here and just let the water do the work. And with light pressure, I can do a little bit of scrubbing and just kind of clean up that edge so I'm more happy with it. And then I can return with my water. Now, if you're working on inexpensive watercolor paper, you may have to be very, very careful with lifting and erasing because inexpensive watercolor paper will want to tear. So it's kind of important that you're working with quality materials. So I have a little bit of water down. I'm now going to use a real soft light value of those brown tones with burnt sienna. And I'm just going to be real careful going up against the edge of the back of the bird. I'm constantly pausing to look at my reference photos so I don't accidentally put the browns in an area where they don't belong. Trying to get around that branch. Once again, I'm using the very end of my round brush to kind of indicate the texture and direction of the feathers. When it gets up close to the blue feathers, though, we have to be aware that those blue feathers are overlapping the brown. So I have to work my brush in multiple directions. So I'm implying where those blue feathers are kind of overlapping. I'm holding my brush very vertical when I'm at the ends. That allows me some nice thin, narrow line work for the feathers. Try not to rest my hand in that wet area where the feathers are drying on the chest. Again, where I meet the back of the head and where the feathers change into more of a blue teal, I'm using the tip of my round brush to indicate that texture and direction of the feathers coming down off the back of the head. When I get close to my pinks and purples, most of them are already dry, but I'm still being very aware and trying to overlap as minimally as possible. If there are some areas of white in between the two zones, I'm okay with that. I want to darken up the tones of burnt sienna and brown towards the base. And now I'm going to give that area some space to dry. Now while these areas are drying, again I have to move on to a different area of my bird that isn't sharing an edge. So I'm going to move on to the tail on the underside here. I'm going to start with my Cerulean Blue, and I'm going to paint wet on dry. And I just want to get right underneath the branch here, just below the belly. I want the edge of the branch and moss to be rough. I don't want to smooth that out too much. There is a darker navy blue and a portion of the tail that I may choose to just kind of add some of my purple lake to my blue to get a deeper tone, and maybe even some Payne's gray. But for now, I just want to get this softer baby blue in just below this branch. And as I move to the right, nearing the feet, the blue actually gets lighter in value. So I'm going to add some water to my brush, and instead of painting with the color, I'm just going to drag some of this color over using a wet brush, and that will actually soften to a lighter value automatically. If I run into the claws of the feet, again, I don't really mind it because the claws are such a dark value and they'll be one of the last things we paint. So if there's some soft blue in those areas, it's not going to really mess anything up. I'm not going to really worry about separating the different portions of the tail at this stage. I just want to get a light value of blue over the entire tail. Once this first layer dries, then I can add some definition and separation between the different parts of the tail by just adding glazes of other colors on top to slowly push the values and tones. I'm just going to let that tail dry now and check in on the rest of the bird that I had started. So some of these areas are still a little cold to the touch. So for peace of mind, I'm going to hit this with a blow dryer before I continue to the next area. I just noticed I missed an area underneath the branch with my blue on the tail. So I'm just going to come in here real quick. And although this will be a darker blue later, I just want to kind of establish its location so I don't accidentally forget about this area and paint it the wrong color later. Now that I've blow dried the top of my bird, I can continue with the feather colors. So on the back of the head, we have this beautiful darker blue that kind of moves to a teal, but we got to be aware of the white feathers just above the eye. So I'm going to apply just a little bit of water in here, staying away from where those white feathers will be. I'm giving that area space. But I want just a little bit of water so I have at least some working time to get the shapes the way I'd prefer. I'm not bringing the water right up to the edge because I don't want to accidentally cover up some of the other colors that I already have there. While this area is nice and damp, I'm going to use a little bit of Payne's Gray mixed with my Cerulean Blue. And when I say a little bit of Payne's Gray, I really mean just a little bit. And because of that added water on my paper, my values are going to want to automatically soften to a lighter value than what's mixed on my palette. When I get into these real small, tight areas, I prefer to be working with a smaller brush, just so I have better visibility and confidence that I'm getting the shapes where I want. I'm using the point of this small round brush to really kind of help with the texture of the feathers. As I move up towards the back of the head, the color starts changing to be a lighter value and to include a little bit more of that Viridian Hue or Viridian Hue teal color. So again, I'm being aware of the direction of the feathers. They are kind of growing back horizontally. I want the colors towards the upper portion of the head to be lighter in value, so I have good contrast between. While that portion of the head is drying, I'm now going to move on to the belly of the bird and get some of those blue tones in there. I'm going to get quite a bit of water down because this is a larger shape. So again, always with those larger shapes, I want extra working time to kind of get the shape and color and values that I want. I'm not getting right up to the edge because it's hard to see with clear water where I'm at. So I am giving some space. It'll be much easier to see where I'm applying my color once I have the paint on my brush. Notice how I change the direction that I'm holding my brush, so that narrow point of my round brush can actually mimic the gaps in between the texture I had achieved previously. The narrow areas that are kind of separated by masking fluid will be quick to dry, so I'm watching those. Now that I have water in this area and everything is nice and damp, I'm going to remove any excess puddling of water just so I can have easier time controlling where my paint goes. So I'm just drying my brush using a kitchen sponge and taking that dry brush and tapping the larger puddles so I can just make sure my water is evenly dispersed. Now at the lower front of the bird, it is a more lighter value of that cerulean blue. I'm making sure that my round brush is being held so the point is down in the direction where the feathers end so I can create that feather texture. I'm really slowing down when I get close to my edges and taking my time. If my light blue overlaps with my purple lake on the chest of the bird, you'll notice that the colors actually create this beautiful purple where overlapped, so I'm not really stressed about it. Switch to a smaller brush if you want to when you get into these tighter areas. Once I have these lighter blues on the underside of the belly, now I'm going to start pushing my values to be a little darker, so less water, more paint. Trying to make sure the top of the branch is kind of rugged and rough. Where the feathers get closer to the brown feathers, there are some lighter values of blue. So I will be watering down some of the blues when I start getting towards this top portion. So especially up in this area here, in between all three colors, it's much more watered down and lighter in value. So I've just added a little water to my brush without completely rinsing the paint out to soften the value. I went a little heavy with my masking fluid. That's why you're seeing quite a few whites in this area. That's just the masking fluid resisting my paint color. As I move towards the back portion of the bird underneath the brown feathers, I'm going to switch back to my darker blue, which was that cerulean blue that I added just a little bit of Payne's gray to. Now I'm going to let this area dry. And I can now add a little bit of color to the beak. So I am going to start, believe it or not, with a blue, painting wet on dry. Trying to be very aware of those white feathers and going around them. Try not to cover up the white feathers that are on the lower left of the beak. Once I get the majority of the beak kind of filled in with that blue, I'm now going to switch to a darker Payne's gray, and I'm just going to paint right on top of that blue and kind of blend the two colors. I want to be very careful and slow when I get to the very end of the beak, because it's easy to keep painting the beak, trying to get that perfect end, and feeling like, oh, it's not perfect yet, go back. Oh, it's not perfect yet, go back. And then it just gets longer and longer. So I would encourage you to be okay with a less than perfect beak so that your beak doesn't continue to elongate as you try to pursue perfection. It's okay for your painting to look like a painting. I just added a little bit of water to my brush so the Payne's gray that it has is a little softer now. Now I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so I can begin working on the branch. Okay, now that I have blown dried everything, now I can just get some base color in the branch. We have lots of browns, soft grays, soft blues. It's really pretty random. So I'm just going to get in here with some water all over the branch. Because we have that masking fluid there, it's going to help maintain some of those lighter values without fear of covering them up. And I just want to get all kinds of different colors and textures in this branch without going too dark right out the gate. So I'm being slow and careful when I get up to the edges of my moss and branch, trying to make sure I don't put that water into the background or onto the feathers of my bird. I'm going to choose to go right over the feet of my bird, not even worrying about it, because those feet have a lot of similar colors to the branch that it is grabbing. So I'm just going to go right over those feet with my water. Once I have water all over my branch, I just want to get some color in here. So I see some soft blues, so I'm just dabbing in some blues. It's going to be kind of hard to see where you put your blue paint, because if you're using the same masking fluid as the masking fluid itself is tinted a soft blue. So it can make it kind of challenging to see where your colors are. My eyes are constantly bouncing back and forth between my painting and my reference photo to help guide where I want certain colors. There's really no wrong way to mess up this first layer. We just want a variety of color and texture. So as long as it's not boring, then you've achieved what you need to. Because again, this is just layer one. We're just getting some base color in. I'm going to get some of this mossy green color that I used in the background. I'm going to put just a little bit of this on the branch. I like the results of mixing burnt sienna with a little bit of purple lake. I think it provides a really warm color that I enjoy. So I'm going to now add some of the darker values on the branch, just in a few select areas. Nothing too heavy. If you need to switch to a smaller brush, you can. I know there's a lot of funky textures in the moss, so don't feel like you have to stick with a large brush. I just prefer working with a large brush because it gets me further faster I just have to be careful. You can tell that I'm not being super particular about where my color goes. I'm letting the colors kind of blend with the water and be a little on the random side. I just want some fun textures. But I am slowing down dramatically and taking my time on my outer edges. In the area of the feet, I'm choosing to paint the branch the color that I see the feet are. And then I can always do a glaze of darker color below and around the feet to kind of glaze the branch to give a little bit more contrast between the two elements. But for now, I'm just choosing to go with that lighter brown tone that I see the feet are, and just slowing down to get into those thin, narrow crevices. Switch to a smaller brush if you have to give yourself the visibility and control you need. Because the branch has so much texture on it, I'm really not worried about blooms, areas that are drying, getting brush strokes. I'm just kind of embracing all of that. The values at the end of this branch get quite a bit lighter, so I'm going to use a dry brush that is clean to kind of soak up some of that darker color so I can lighten the end of the branch. I'm going to add a little bit of blue as well, so I can get a range of color in here. I'm continuing with a really watered down version of kind of this dingy blue with a little bit of the brown in it, just to get some value in all areas of the branch. I can water down some Payne's gray. Sometimes just dotting your color in instead of doing brush strokes to fill the area. Just dot, and that's going to help with the texture as well for the moss. So I have all kinds of color and texture into this branch. Again, it's just the first layer, so I'm not worried about it being perfect. I'm now going to switch to a smaller brush so I can get some details on the head eye area. I've dipped my brush into some of the burnt sienna because right above the bird's eye there is burnt sienna. And then as I work my way out away from the eye towards the beak, there is some more burnt sienna that continues. Okay, so now we have practically a base layer of color in all the areas where we need it. The branch is still drying, this tiny area by the eye is still drying, but everywhere else now I can proceed with a second layer to try and get some darker values and get some texture in the feathers. So I'm going to get a darker value of my purple lake. And I want to kind of create this semicircle that goes around the bottom of the head. And I'm trying to allow some spacing between my brush strokes so I get that texture for the feathers. I'm going to continue with this method in any areas where I feel like, maybe the purples on the chest just aren't quite dark enough. I'm just glazing this purple lake on the chest to darken those tones. And I am following the direction of the feathers so I can get that texture and make this bird look really fluffy. So try not to fill it completely in. Allow some of those lighter values to peek through. And follow the contour of your bird. Try not to go too straight with your texture. There should be a subtle curve that kind of follows that chest shape. Now that I've added some texture to the purple chest, I'm now going to create a darker tone of my pink, which is that permanent rose. I'm going to add some of that burnt sienna to it. And using this darker value without overloading my brush, so I made sure to kind of dab some of the paint off so it's not super heavy, and that allows me to get the thin line work. So I'm keeping my brush practically vertical towards the ceiling, and I'm keeping my pressure really, really light, so I'm grazing the top surface with just the very end of my brush. And that allows me to get those thin, feather-like texture. You don't want to press as hard as you would a pencil when you're writing a note. That's too much pressure. So we just want to kind of get some texture in here without covering up all those light values. I'm now going to make a darker mixture of my burnt sienna for the back brown feathered area. I'm going to add just a touch of Payne's gray to it. Needs to be a very small amount because Payne's gray is a pretty strong pigment. I don't want to go too dark too fast. I'm just trying to get a softer, kind of chocolatey brown mixed up. Now I can kind of look at my reference photo and add some contour to some of these feathers without covering up the highlights. And try not to put too much pressure on yourself while you're painting. A lot of times people try to do photorealism right out the gate, and that's a lot of pressure. Painting should be fun and relaxing. Just enjoy the process of applying the color to the paper. Enjoy feeling the strokes of the paint on the paper. I'm adding some definition to this feather that's overlapping the back by just putting a glaze of this darker brown so we can kind of tell where one feather is and another one begins. I'm going to continue with some of this brown on the top of the head. I don't want to go too dark too fast though. So I want to just add a few textures here on the forehead. But there's a lot of lighter values up here on the top of the head, so I don't want to cover all that up. I'm going to darken up some of the browns around the eye, especially the back of the eye, where there's some shadows from the brow. So I'm just taking a darker brown and glazing right on top of the dry paint that I had there previously to push the values. Now I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's gray to my Cerulean Blue so I can get a darker value. Very light on the Payne's gray. It's a very strong pigment. Now that I have a darker blue mixed up, I can get some texture in these areas. So one, I like the idea of having some shadow beneath the purple feathers on the chest. I don't want to do the texture everywhere because then it's going to get too heavy. Now the feather direction kind of changes off and on. So we have some feathers that are going a little bit more on the vertical side. And then we have feathers just behind them that are going in the opposite direction. So we kind of end up creating this crosshatch technique when we're painting some areas of the feather. So again, I'm pausing to really study my reference photo, see what the direction of the lines are going and how long they are. And then if there's an opportunity to do a little bit of cross-hatching, I'm doing that. Trying to follow the contour and direction of the feathers. Some lines are really short, some are quite long, so I'm paying attention to that as well. In the back of the bird, we have kind of a layering of blue feathers, and I want to just add a glaze of color so I can define where they're at. I'm going to continue with this glaze on the underside of the branch to the tail below. So I'm just doing a glaze of this same blue on top of the blue I put down previously. So it looks like these darker feathers continue down onto the tail below the branch. I'm going to water down this blue just a bit so it's not quite as intense. And I'm going to add some feather texture towards the back of the head. In this area, it's a lot lighter in value, so that's why I watered it down. I still want some texture, but I don't want to mess up my values. Now, when we get closer to that central area of the head behind the eye, the blues get quite a bit darker, so I'm returning to my darker blue mixture. I'm going to take a little bit of that mossy green color that we used in the background, which was the mixture of Viridian Hue and burnt sienna. And I'm just going to get a lighter version of this color in some areas on the top of the head. So being aware of those white feathers above the eye, try not to cover them up. But I just want to get some select soft greens in here. I'm going to use some soft browns and some short line work and very light pressure. I just want to indicate these real delicate, soft feathers that are above the beak. My brush is still following the contour and direction of those feathers as I work. Now I'm going to use a darker brown. So it's the burnt sienna with just a touch of that Payne's gray. And I'm using a small brush. And I just want to push some of the darker values that I see near the eye. So I'm going to come off the front of the eye, kind of where a tear duct would be. And I'm going to do a horizontal line towards the beak. There is some texture in this area. So using the darker brown, I'm just going to create some texture in the front area. I'm going to darken up some of the values behind the eye. When I see texture in my reference photo, I choose to dab my brush to kind of create dot work rather than trying to do line work. To create the scales that are around the bird's eye, I'm just using a small brush and kind of creating this line of circles. So it looks like scales. I'm going to do the same thing on the underside of the eye. I'm just having to use very light pressure and a small brush. You can practice this on a separate piece of paper if you feel like you may need a little bit of practice. I'm going to fill the eye with a lighter brown. I have to let that dry before I do any additional layers on the eyes. I'm going to create a darker blue yet by adding just a little bit more Payne's gray to my mixture. In a few select areas, I just want to push these blues to be darker still. Paying attention to the length of my line. Sometimes they're very short, sometimes they're long. I'm layering some of this blue on top of the brown to just kind of push some of the darks that I see. With this darker blue, I'm going to push some of the shadows that are in the area of the purple feathers on the chest. So I really want to kind of establish that head ruffle. So I'm just getting some darker shadows in there. I can tap with a paper towel if I feel like they're just a little too intense. If there's areas in the darker purple feathers that need a little bit more shadow, I'm just using this darker blue to establish those. So it looks like layered feathers. I'm going to take this moment to use that dark blue to help push some of the shadows in my branch. I can even add more Payne's gray to darken it up. But I'm going to focus on the darkest areas that I see in the branch first. So I want to kind of find an area where I know exactly where it's at, because I'm kind of referring to the bird also. Don't worry too much about blending anything in. Just think of it as like little scribbles and textures and dots. Try not to smooth out the texture on the branch too much. I find it helpful to dot occasionally. I'm just focusing on the absolute darkest colors of the branch. And I am pausing occasionally to just try and get relatively close to what I'm seeing in my reference photo. Now right now all these darks on the branch look a bit odd, but once we get all the other colors and textures in, it'll kind of bring it into completion. Now I'm going to water down my Payne's gray so it's more of a medium brown, or medium gray I should say. And I'm just going to try establish some of those medium tones that are in the branch. And again, sometimes dabbing and creating kind of this glorified scribble will help you create that texture rather than filling in and making big broad shapes. Think of just adding some groupings of dots going in the direction of whatever shadow you're trying to establish. I'm going to work a little bit with some brown, but I'm going to add some purple to it. So it's a little bit of a warmer brown. And I am going to add a little bit of Payne's gray to it. I'm going to water this down. And then with this color, I'm just going to try and get some more values in with the branch. And you'll notice that I am not brushing it on to be smooth. I want this to look like rough bark and moss. So I'm applying it in a very rough and unpredictable way. And I'm not putting pressure on myself to follow the photo exactly. As long as I kind of give a hint of that texture, then whoever's viewing my painting will get the gist that it's on a branch. So when you look at this branch close up, it doesn't quite make any sense. It's kind of difficult to tell what it is I'm trying to paint. But then when you take a step back from your painting and look at the texture and the range of values you've created, then all of a sudden it reads accurately. So when in doubt, just take a break. Take a step back, get yourself a fresh perspective. I'm now near the feet of the bird, so I'm trying to be very careful and going around the feet with some of the shadows so I don't completely cover them up. Feet are full of scales, so there's a lot of texture in them, but right now I just need to establish where they're at so I don't forget about them, because they're kind of hard to see with that color I put on the branch. There's a lot of darks in the branch right under this area of the bird because of the shadows that the feathers from the chest are creating, so I'm really trying to push those darks. I'm going to use some of that mossy green color and just using a stippling dotting technique. I just want to add some texture into some areas of the moss. I don't want to completely cover up all the light values I've established, so I'm still deliberately trying to stick to the areas that are just a hair darker than what I've already established. So the branch is definitely starting to get that texture that I want. I'm going to return to the bird and give a little bit more life to the eye. So I'm going to get a really nice dark brown with Payne's gray. So this almost looks like a sepia color because it's such a dark brown. And with a small brush, I want to take my time and try and get a thin, narrow line that goes across the top of the eye. This line will also continue down and around the pupil. Eyes are something that I feel like are very important, so I try not to go on autopilot and just paint what I believe eyes look like. I really try to pause and look at the photo. That way I can get, hopefully, a little bit more of a realistic result. So I'm definitely paying attention to all the darkest shadows in this area. Dark shadows around the scales. There's quite a few dark shadows that are directly behind the eye. Using a darker Payne's gray and a small brush, I'm going to establish some texture in the beak. So I want to first get the center of the beak. There's a strong shadow on the underside of the beak as well. So I'm just going to put a glaze on the underside to really push those values. And then we have an area near the nostril that comes up. Now that the darks in the eye have dried, I'm going to add some blue to some of the areas where I see a reflection. So it's going to be right above where we put the masking fluid. And I'm going to let this blue area dry before I add more to the eye. There's not many areas on our bird that have a black. So I want to water down the black so it's a little bit more of a mid-tone. But there are a few areas that should be just a hair darker. So right underneath the blue feathers, in this little area, I'm going to add some blacks for shadows. Just a couple below the blue feathers in a few select additional areas. Since this black, or Payne's gray I should say, is a little bit more watered down, it's not quite as dark as a true black, which is kind of nice, because then you can just carefully glaze it over top of a few areas, just making short little dashed lines to just push some of the depth. There's a few areas in the chest of the bird with the purple feathers that have a little bit more of a stronger shadow. So I'm just going to add a touch here and there, nothing too crazy. Sometimes the lines are really short, sometimes they're a little longer. I'm going to add some definition to define some of the layers in the brown feathers here. Again, trying not to go too dark or too heavy. I'm going to push a little bit of my dark values in my brown feathers. Just trying to be real selective with it. Keeping my brush really light, not overloading it with paint, and trying to keep a real gentle pressure when I do my line work. Now I'm going to use some of the Payne's gray and dark blue to do a glaze in the feathers of the tail. There's an area of the tail that is very dark and in shadow because of the feathers above. So I just want to kind of darken up this narrow area of the tail. So I'm just doing a glaze. With this dark blue, I'm going to continue to do glaze on the underside of the bird. I'm going to darken up my black a bit, and in order to make these tail feathers look like they're overlapping each other, I'm going to add a nice strong dark shadow below the feather layer. Now I'm going to mix the darkest Payne's gray I can manage without it getting chalky. So I still want it transparent, but I want to really push the darks in the eye of the bird. So right in the center without covering up some of the blue highlights. Since this is very much a focal point, I want to just kind of push the values of that eye a little darker. Now while that is drying, I can pay a little bit more attention to the feet of the bird. The feet are a pretty strong focal point, so I want to take my time. If you feel like you just need a break from the painting for the day, I encourage you to take a break. That way you come back with some energy to kind of not rush the feet. So I'm going to start by just trying to kind of get the shape of the scales that are on the top ridge of the feet. So I'm just kind of stacking semicircles. And I am doing this in a lighter color because I don't want to go too dark too fast, just in case I don't really like my line work. Right now, I'm just trying to kind of get a feel for where I want to put my details. So I'm going to go a little lighter. So stacking my semicircles to try and establish the scales. I'm going to let some of these scale details dry before I continue with details in the foot area, because I want to add some darks, but I can't do that if a lot of the areas where I just painted scales are still kind of damp. So I just want to give those some time to dry. So in the meantime, if my branch and the surrounding areas near my branch are completely dry, I can actually remove the masking fluid at this stage. So I can take a rubber cement pickup, or I can just use clean fingertips and rub. But I'm just removing that masking fluid to reveal those highlights that we've maintained. And you'll notice how important those highlights are. That way our branch doesn't get too dark. staying away from the feet because I know some areas of the feet are still damp, but everywhere else I can remove this masking fluid. I know my eye is still damp, but everywhere else I can remove my masking fluid in here as well. I have some masking fluid on the beak. Now right now I have some areas of white that are just really, really bright because of the masking fluid I applied. But what sometimes we forget is once you remove the masking fluid and you have some of these bright whites, there's nothing stopping you from putting just a real soft glaze of color on top of those whites so that they don't seem so bright. So if I go in here and just with a glaze of that same purple over top of those areas, now they're not such a bright white. Now they're just kind of little highlights. So it still makes a difference. And if there are areas where your masking fluid was removed and you're like, wow, I just don't like that shape, put some paint in there, cover it up. So I'm just adding some soft glazes of watered down purple and pink in these areas so it's not super bright. Even in the areas where we have all the white fur by the beak, just a really watered down color just to give at least a hint of color in there really helps. I'm going to do the same thing above the eye of the bird. I don't want this big area of just blank white. I want there to be some values in here. So I'm just going to have some really watered down colors, and I'm going to be very selective and just get a little bit of color in here. I can do the same thing with the whites that are in the area of my blue feathers. I can just get a watered down blue color that isn't too dark And I can just tint these bright whites so they're still going to be lighter than the rest. So I'm just continuing to glaze some of these brighter whites. Now that I've kind of removed the masking fluid, I can check on the eye, make sure that's completely dry. If it is, I can remove the masking fluid there as well. And I like to add some blue to the white reflection. Just so it has a little bit more of a realistic appearance. So once I've added a little bit of blue to the eye of the bird, now I'm going to work on adding a little bit more definition to the feet area. So this area of my branch I feel like is very incomplete. So I'm going to be very selective and light-handed, but I need some darks in here to give some depth. So to the left side, where this foot is coming in contact with the branch, I just need to push a little bit darker. I also need to define, where that claw is coming out of the foot. And I can add a little bit more dark values to that claw. If I feel like there's some areas of the scale that I can darken up and add some shadow to, I can do that as well. But I want to be really selective with my darks. I don't want to do too much. Painting the feet of a bird is not necessarily the most fun, but if you just focus on the shapes, focus on the values, I promise you'll get through it. Just take your time, give yourself frequent breaks if you need them. While you're painting the feet of your bird, be aware that if you keep trying to pursue a perfect curve on one of the little feet talons, they're going to keep getting longer and longer and longer, and eventually they're going to stop looking like feet. So just be okay with it not being perfect and stop before you keep going too far. So I feel like I at least have some detail in their feet. I don't know that it's my favorite, but they're there. I'm now going to get some darker blacks because there's a lot of dark blacks or Payne's grays right in here on the underside of this branch. So I want to make sure that I get this as dark as I need to. Again, it doesn't have to be applied smooth and perfect. Embrace the texture, so dabbing your brush to get that texture in there can help. And then last but not least, if you have any additional final details that you want to do in the moss or branch area, you can. I find it helpful to kind of go around like an edge of some of the whites, so it kind of looks like a shadow for that area of the moss sticking out. I don't do it everywhere, but I at least want some line work. And again, I'm embracing the texture. I'm trying not to go on autopilot. And if you feel like some of your whites are a little much, you can go in with a real soft watered down color, and you can do some of that stippling texture with just a muted color, just to give a little bit more texture and life to those areas that might appear a little too white. So I'm just going to use a really watered down bluish gray. I'm going to make sure it's just a real soft value, nothing too dark. And I can go into some of these whites and just do a little bit of that stippling action where I'm just kind of dotting and scribbling some of the blues in just a few areas. Nothing too heavy, just to add a hint of shadows. But otherwise, this is our bird. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I would absolutely love to see your finished paintings, so feel free to send me an email or tag